key to life.
Hello, this is Sekou Burmese, your host of The Lit Review, a podcast brought to you by the Academy of Management Journal. In this podcast, we dive into the insights of recent research published in the journal and interview authors and corporate leaders to discuss the inspiration for those ideas, as well as insights that can apply to current pressing issues in organizations and markets. This episode, I speak with Hatim Rahman, an assistant professor of management and organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. In our conversation, we talk about a recent paper he published in AMJ with co-authors about digital labor platforms and how experimentation by platform designers can impact worker autonomy. I also talk with Hatim about the current state of employer-labor relations and the future impact of digital platforms on employment, including a prediction by Hatim that might already be true by the time this podcast airs. I hope that you enjoy this episode of The Lit Review and my discussion with Hatim Rahman. My guest today on the Lit Review podcast is Hatim Rahman, an assistant professor of management and organizations at Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management. His research investigates how artificial intelligence, undergirded by algorithms, is impacting the nature of work and employment relationships in organizations and labor markets. Since graduating with his PhD from Stanford, his research and teaching have received numerous awards. Here I get to embarrass him a bit, including an NSF Career Award, and also named one of the best 40 business school professors under 40 by Poets and Quants. Hatim, welcome to the Lit Review podcast.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the generous introduction.
It's my pleasure. It's very easy. It's very easy. And also, you're at my alma mater, so I feel we're kindred spirits right now. How cold is it right there? Is it there in Evanston these days?
Well, with climate, global change, climate warming, we're actually experiencing unseasonably warmth. We've been in the 70s last couple of weeks.
I'm sad that I asked, because by now, when I was there as a PhD student, it was hitting the 50s and trending down quickly. So
the sweaters were out by now, right?
Yeah. So I'm happy for you, but I mourn for our world, I guess. I'd like to start by discussing the forthcoming AMJ paper that you have with Tim Weiss and Arvind Karunakaran that looks at how experimentation on digital labor platforms impacts worker autonomy. So I'm going to try and summarize your paper in like 2 seconds, but correct anything if I go astray.
Sure.
So you start the paper by suggesting that companies often run experiments with their employees to test new practices. And oftentimes these experiments will impinge upon the autonomy of workers in some way. And usually workers can navigate this by leaning on interpersonal relationships that they have with others at work. But then I think your paper does an interesting thing by, questioning to what extent does this happen when you're in a more disconnected workplace. And so you can think about, just working more remotely, and companies are doing this more. And you choose a really interesting setting. And so you have this really rich kind of qualitative study where you investigate this from a worker's perspective within a digital labor platform. So before we get into the paper, I do want to ask, what got you interested in the topic of worker autonomy and digital platforms?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, I since I did my PhD at Stanford in the, I guess, 2000, mid 2010 to 20 timeframe, there was a lot of rhetoric about the gig economy more broadly and the future of work entailing a situation where workers will have almost full autonomy, right? We get to choose our schedule. Mm-hmm. We get to choose what we work on, when we work on. So I was swimming in that rhetoric, and I was actually in the engineering school. So a lot of the people there were the ones who were designing these systems and in good faith, I think with good intentions, envisioning this future. And the ethos of my PhD training and my research is to look at what's happening on the ground. And so that's the approach I took. And when I started to do that, I kind of was believing the rhetoric of like, oh, wow, it's kind of so great that people can choose when they want to work, what platforms they want to work. And so what hit me really quickly was a lot of the rhetoric did not match workers' experiences. And so wanting to highlight and understand the conditions and circumstances where actually both are true. Workers do feel some of the positives that occur with this shift to the gig economy, remote work, so on and so forth. But even as we've seen, in our own experiences, there's usually more to it than just the positives.
No, that's true, and I'm always fascinated by how often my research questions will be motivated by, man, this is the third Wall Street Journal article I've read about this, and they're all taking the same angle.
Yeah.
I wonder, does anyone really check that out, right? And so oftentimes swimming in the rhetoric, as you put it, really does kind of get the juices flowing on the research side. So what do you think were the key findings from your paper? And it's a great paper. I urge everyone to check it out. It really is a great read. But what do you think were the key findings that people should take away from the paper?
Thanks. So one of the fundamental findings that we have is revealing what we call different experimentation regimes. Mm-hmm. And the reason we use that word, actually, shout out to one of our reviewers, was just to highlight from a worker's perspective how they experienced different types of experimentation companies run. And so the three key experimentation regimes that we highlighted was what we call explicit experimentation regime. And this is what a lot of people are familiar with beta testing, in which you ask people to opt into different types of new features that a company or policies that a company or a platform wants to test. So that's the first one that we found was, and it coincided when the organization and platform we were observing was just starting out. And so as maybe existing theory would predict, that generally enhanced workers' autonomy because they were able to express their ideas, and the corporation incorporated it into their product features. And it really, I think, there's some evidence that helped them scale and improve the platform. So that's the first. So one is this experimentation regimes. And the second one that we uncovered was what we called a concealed experimentation regime, in which instead of the participation being voluntary, it became a sign where you no longer were told whether you're being participating in an experiment or not. So if you logged on, you could be assigned a condition, a treatment condition where the availability of your status is being experimented on, where others didn't. So that's the second concealed. And then the third experimentation regime that we uncovered is what we called unbounded, where it's no longer like a specific feature that's being tested, but the frequency and scope of experimentation is now continuous and expansive. Yeah. So I think those three experimentation regimes is one of the central findings. And then, we kind of lead the paper with this, is where we, I guess to zoom out, the macro thing that we want to take people away from is that where we kind of put forward this metaphor of the experimental hand, where, kind of tying back to previous metaphors of the invisible hand, experimentation can shape people's experiences and autonomy in unexpected ways, in second-ordered ways that aren't necessarily captured with the intended effects of experimentation.
Yeah, and I love the experimental hand. Shout out to the invisible, the visible. I think those are the two hands that I'm most aware of. Right. So now we have a third one. And you make some interesting, or paint at least an interesting picture, I think, about maybe what are some of the long-term effects that experimentation has on worker autonomy. And so, I was curious, since you kind of broached that topic, what do you think is the role of the digital labor platforms as we think about kind of the time that we're in? It's fairly tumultuous, a lot of employer labor relations, things in the news. And it seems as if there is a great renegotiation happening. I know we were on the great resignation, and now we're in the great renegotiation. Yeah. And so what do you think is the role of digital labor platforms? And maybe tell us a little bit about what digital labor platforms are, examples, so that people can kind of understand it.
Sure. And I want to answer that in two parts. One, when you said the long-term effects, and this I think is also one of the main contributions of our paper, is that a lot of times when organizations are implementing an experiment, you define the research question, the hypothesis, and the dependent variables in a very confined manner. And so you are able to see, what is the effect of one experiment in a bounded domain. But when we looked at this longitudinally across 15, 16 years, is when we began to see, well, no, it's like for these workers, when they're continuously exposed to these experiments, it's no longer about measuring or it's not necessarily no longer. In addition to looking at the bounded, one experiment, we're able to kind of trace out these longer term effects. So that's one thing I just wanted to mention that I think is relevant. So the second thing on the digital platform side, the reason that I found this to be very generative is because I think there's a lot of evidence is that it provides a microcosm of the broader dynamics that we see playing out in society. So because on the digital realm, there, from maybe an economist perspective, there is very little transaction cost. So you could test out an idea very simply, very easily. And in fact, in the paper, we have a footnote talking about how Uber prominently says that they do 1,000 experiments at any one time.
Yeah,
they're running simultaneously, right? There's a very quote unquote little cost, but I think again the dynamics we see play out more generally and spill over, especially as our digital and offline, so to speak, life are more and more integrated. So let me just give you one example, right? So while we were writing this paper, and it was in the review process, it came out that LinkedIn was running an experiment for over 5 years, 20 million users, so on and so forth. And it turns out that the experiment had a real effect on people's ability to get jobs, right? Offline. So there's a lot been reported on it, but one of the takeaways that reporters highlighted, and we were like, oh, just wait for our paper to come out because we talked exactly about this, was they contacted LinkedIn and they asked, like, did you account for the effect that real workers, some of them had more opportunities and others didn't? And we know from a lot of research that the opportunities you get, especially early on in your career and even later on, they have an outsized impact on your social mobility, your income mobility, so on and so forth. So and sorry if I went too broad there, but
no.
I think that a lot of the dynamics we're seeing, they're playing out again, with generative AI now, and we saw this with, it's in the news a lot with the writers' strike. So a lot of the issues are very similar in that the fact that all of a sudden all of the things that we were producing on the quote unquote offline world are now accessible online and subject to experimentation, and the questions about autonomy get played out there very saliently.
So a couple of things that I wrote down as you were kind of noting it, like one of the interesting pieces of this as an academic reading about it is because we love experimentation, right? So academics love it, but we have this thing called the Institutional Review Board. And IRB, it's the three letters that I think academics fear even more than IRS. So IRB, and part of why the IRB is there is to make sure that in these experiments that we dream up, there's not material harm to participants.
That's right.
And what is interesting about the idea of experimentation within the corporate space is there is no IRB. So if the people designing it haven't thought through things, then you can have things like this, like what LinkedIn kind of faced as well. And so, maybe more academics need to be hired by LinkedIn. No, I won't say that. But I think, the idea of experimentation or doing it in a responsible way is another kind of key takeaway that I got from your paper as well.
That's right. And so one of the things that I like some reviewers mentioned, and again, the review process can be very beneficial. And actually, I think that our review process was fantastic in helping us enhance our ideas.
You hear that, all authors? Sorry, plug for AMJ and the review process. An author just said it was great. So send your papers here. All right, sorry, continue.
That's right. It can happen, especially at AMJ, right? So, this is the other thing that as a researcher we try to bring forward is that a lot of times what happens in the digital, it seems new. It seems like, wow, this is happening, but we do have a lot that we can learn. And if you think about when I mentioned concealed, unbounded experimentation, right? If you look at the Tuskegee experiments, the Stanford prison experiment, right? If you think about it, that's what was happening. That medical researchers, academic researchers, they were kind of doing whatever they wanted, and not thinking through some of these things. And so one of the points that the reviewer asked us to articulate more in our discussion was to make these linkages more clear, and the recommendations to organizations, and that there is a lot that we can learn from the medical sciences in academic research, and that we went through decades of trying to put in more robust procedures in place to try to balance the needs to run experiments. And we're very clear in that there are benefits to experiments while balancing workers, subjects, the public's interests. And our hope is, and our point in one of the contributions of the paper is, in the digital realm, we don't want to see the Tuskegee equivalent or the Stanford prison experiment. Before that happens, we hope that there can be changes in place that can balance the interests of both sides more harmoniously.
So this is great. All right. So this leads into another question I want to ask, which is, again, taking a step back, experimentation, right? That is thought to be tightly connected to innovation, right? And so the most innovative companies we know are ones that try, they experiment. I mean, we just talked about LinkedIn, you talked about Uber. I mean, these are platforms that have, in essence, been changed the way we travel and changed the way we find jobs. And so your work kind of suggests that it can lead to less autonomy, right? And it takes a worker-centric perspective, which I think is also something that maybe is a little more rare in our field than it should be. But it seems counterintuitive, right? Experimentation should be good, innovation should be good. But you're saying, when we have the unbounded, right, this last kind of regime, that it can lead to less autonomy, which should lead to less innovative activity, right? The less autonomy I have. This seems counterintuitive. So can you help me and us make sense of that? Like, what am I missing there?
Yeah. So I think there are two things. Let me start with, again, because we've showcased the workers' experience, is that when you start to look at not just one experiment, but look at their experiences, especially workers and users who have been using it for longer stretches of time, is that they're really smart. They know, they begin to see what's going on and what are the contours and boundaries that they're aware of and things that they're not aware of. And so especially in situations and circumstances where people are relying, or their livelihoods are at stake. And so we're looking at a labor platform where they're trying to get work, they're trying to get income, and a lot of people rely on them to different degrees, but nonetheless, they rely on it for their income and work. They don't want to jeopardize that. And so when they come onto the platform and now they know that anything can be subject to an experiment, they can become more restrictive in what they're willing to try. So in related work, I kind of show how people are less willing to work with new clients, for example, right? Because they don't know necessarily what's going on, and so on and so forth. And everyone ends up losing out in that situation and circumstance, right? If you're not able to observe, quote unquote, the natural behavior of participants, what you're picking up could be noise. And so this actually relates to this point of, one of the fundamental assumptions, and you can articulate this better than I can, is independence between treatment groups, right? Where people don't necessarily know, or not, especially in a field experiment, aren't always, they don't know necessarily what the other treatments are, so they can't have what we call in sociology reactivity, right? They can't react to it. And so this is one of the things that we highlight, is as people become aware that anything is subject to experimentation, they begin to think like, oh, everything they're seeing, they should view it in the realm of this could be an experiment, and they should be very carefully think about what could potentially happen in the short and long term, right? So that's something that we highlight in our discussion as well, is that even for organizations that are implementing this, that they have to be more conscious and aware that people are changing their behavior in ways that what they're measuring doesn't necessarily correlate to the actual behavior.
Yeah, no, I love the idea of a suspicious employee, right? Someone that, and I've experienced this in other kind of aspects of life where you're like, all of a sudden, I'm getting a lot more, clients coming in the morning.
Yeah.
What is the platform doing? What are they up to? What's going on here? And they become suspect of why you're here. Why is my traffic higher? Why am I getting more podcast downloads? Are these bots? And that suspicion can decrease my willingness to engage in the platform and also my willingness to trust people and other things that I'm seeing.
That's right.
And as that decreases, then the value of the platform decreases, right? So I guess, one of the key takeaways I see is, the people building these platforms, and platforms are everywhere, Lord help us, recognizing that experimentation is good, but when it can, there definitely some kind of a curvilinear effect around this, right. and going too far, and that third regime, as you talked about, can actually lead to some sowing the seeds of your own downfall for the platform.
Yeah, a lot of platforms, and we've seen this, pretty much in every major platform, right? With Google or Amazon, other things like that, that they are kind of relying on the fact that they're the dominant player on the market, right? And that right now they have network effects. We saw that a little bit with Twitter, and that, I mean, that's getting severely tested. But at some point, if alternatives arise, the nature of these platforms are such that there are very brittle ties with the participants or their workers, that people will be willing to change if there is a credible alternative. Now that's a big if. Yeah. We've seen that in the Amazon space. We've seen that on the Google space. They have been very dominant for a very long time, and alternatives have tried, but it's very hard to break in. Yeah. And we've kind of seen that playing out with legislation, right? We have a huge antitrust lawsuit going on right now between the government and Google and many other companies, Apple's iStore. So I think, our point is we hopefully platforms and organizations don't wait for that to happen, right? Yeah. That they can improve earlier on. And in kind of on the counterintuitive side, one of the key takeaways and one of the earlier questions that we kind of talked, what was surprising to us is that, going back to kind of the theory side of things, is that generally speaking, like a worker's status and success can insulate them to some extent, right? Like we've seen this in our maybe full professors or physicians. They're able to kind of to some extent insulate themselves from new technology or changes that occur in ways that help them. But in the digital platform side, and we see this again with writers and actors, no matter how high status or how much success you have, you're still subject to this type of experimentation in ways that don't necessarily insulate you or protect you from the changes that are occurring.
All right. Well, that's good. I have one last question. I want you to get into the prediction business. Do you believe, we had big oil, we had big telecom, and both of those got broken up. Do you think we're going to see a similar breaking of monopoly for platforms? Do you think that's something that we'll see in the near future?
Historically, it shows that is the trend we're headed, right? Yeah. It's very, very hard, all the way going back to the railroads, probably an industry before that, right? Yeah. It's very difficult for people inside to be able to self-regulate in ways that are productive, right? It's clear that there should be changes for almost in any setting. And again, just to connect with another platform we're all familiar with Airbnb, right? We saw in New York and other cities that it ended up kind of leading to suboptimal outcomes for residents, for people from lower income or in more precarious positions. They ended up getting priced out and getting even further gentrification, right? And so we've seen this play out, unfortunately, in many instances in industries, that you need some sort of third party, whether that could be government, that could be rating agencies. There's a lot of research on that kind of push these ways in productive ways. And maybe I've been reading a little bit more on this, that in the short term for organizations it can be very painful, but in the long term it can be very beneficial, right? Like if you look at Microsoft didn't die with that very severe antitrust that they're subject to. It took them time. But look who's diversified into other areas and is kind of gone to more risky areas that benefited the organization, right? Yeah. So the short answer is yes, I do think we're going to see the breaking up in more either third party or governmental regulation to kind of prod this to occur.
All right, I'm clipping this this piece right here. I'm going to bring it back. When it happens, I'll say like, oh, Hatim, he knew. He knew back in 2023. All right, I'm going to close you out on these last two questions. So the first is just thinking about what's piquing your curiosity these days, right? We talked a little earlier about phenomena that we observe and don't understand. So is there anything right now that really piques your curiosity?
Yeah. So more broadly, my research looks at future work, how technology is changing that. And so this kind of relates to the NSF Career Award that I was talking about, is that the extent to which we're going to be able to reimagine, so to speak, the future of work, we're going to have to figure out how to get more people who have been left behind into higher paying jobs. For better or worse, employment remains the primary mechanism by which people obtain mobility. And, if history is going to play itself out again, what's going to happen, and what I hope my research can hopefully kind of change the direction on, is that people with higher skills, higher degrees are going to reap the benefits of AI and new technology. And people who are lower skills or don't have a college degree, they're going to get the quote unquote digital janitor jobs. And I don't want to see that happen for the future. And so I'm really interested, and there has been momentum with organizations recognizing this as well, particularly with the labor shortage, thinking more creatively about how can we get adults who don't have a college degree to get higher paying jobs? How can we reskill them in the quote unquote age of AI, in which there are a lot of exciting opportunities, but thinking more from the organizational and policy side for how we can try to ensure, again, more people can benefit from the future of work. Yeah. So that's one that's kind of that I'm thinking more about developing new projects around.
Such low-hanging fruit, just social mobility in the age of rampant capitalism. You really need to aim higher, Hatim. No, that's great. Okay, last one. What are you reading right now for fun?
So I can answer the question directly. So right now I'm reading a book called Atlas AI by Kate Crawford.
That does not sound like fun reading. That sounds like research reading.
Well, so the thing is that, as you know, we say it's a labor of love, right? So I really do have a lot of interest in the topics that I'm reading in, but I like to read from different perspectives. I do find it fun to read from, this is from Kate Crawford, who comes more from an STS background. And so I think it's super interesting to think about she's thinking about what are the planetary costs of AI, right? So yeah, it's not fun in the entertainment sense, but it is fun from the expanding or thinking about it in a way that, as scholars trained in a certain discipline, certain area are never really thinking about that angle. But I think that also reflects the fact that I have kids, right? And so what I'm reading for fun tends to be, Franklin the turtle, and
you got young kids. Oh, okay.
Yeah, right. So time is limited in leisure, kind of reading, but I will put a plug out for in terms of fun watching. I do really like a lot of sci-fi areas, because I do think sci-fi is really amazing at reimagining what's possible. Yeah, and they may not get it exactly right, but they're usually really, really good at figuring that out, right? So Upload on Amazon was something that one of my students told me about. That was really good. So a lot of the ones that have come out recently, of course, Black Mirror is a classic, right?
Yeah. Have you watched Severance?
Severance is a great one too. I recently watched it this year. Yeah, it was so. I put a lot of credit to kind of the sci-fi in general. And my sister, often when I tell her about some of my research, she's like, "Oh, have you seen the Star Trek episode?" I'm like, "I haven't, but I bet that they were right on about this." Yeah,
that's considered research, my friend. You can do it. When I was doing my dissertation and studying the advertising industry, watching Mad Men was considered research time, to me at least. So
that's right.
There you go. All right. Well, I can tell you, as the kids get older, the reading that you do with them gets better. And so over pandemic, I read all of Harry Potter with my kids, and getting to dive back into that world with them was a lot of fun. So a lot of my
I can't wait for that.
Yeah, it's coming. Don't worry.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for your time. And it was great talking to you and catching up and hearing more about your very interesting research.
And thanks for hosting, facilitating. I mean, I know it's interesting, but it is a service to our profession that myself and others benefit from. So thank you so much.
It is a labor of love, as you said. Thank you. You're very welcome. All right, that's it for the Lit Review. I appreciate Hatim for his time, and I appreciate you all for listening. If you like this episode, please subscribe to the Lit Review podcast. You can find this podcast by searching The Lit Review and AMJ Podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and other podcast platforms, as well as on the AMJ homepage. You can also follow us on Twitter or X, where we have a weekly Spaces show called AMJ Radio Live, which is hosted on the AOM Connect account. I'll be joining the show once a month to provide a behind-the-scenes look at the podcast and answer any listener questions. Thank you to the Academy of Management for their support for this podcast. Special thanks to my producer, Holly Fearing, for all of her work behind the scenes, making this podcast sound incredible. Our theme music is produced by Key to Life. This is Sekou. See you next time. Take care and be good.